gamble. Indeed, every other Friday night, which was payday, Titanic, who was known as Sergeant Thomas by his men, organized casino nights, during which time he cleaned out most of the men foolish enough to take part, although he would reportedly take it a bit easier on the country boys like himself. In the end, Titanic would never fight in the First World War, as the conflict ended before he was sent overseas. He would, though, reportedly come out of his time in the army some $50,000 richer due to his gambling and his sergeant's salary. Now, you would think after being away for so long, Titanic would want to get home to his lovely wife, Alice. However, Pittsburgh would not be his first stop upon getting out of the army. Instead, he headed for Rogers, Arkansas, where his mother still lived, raising his half-brothers and sisters on her own, as her second husband had died some years earlier, leaving her alone on the farm with their children. Now, Titanic hadn't seen or talked to her in years, and he hadn't let her know he was coming, so she was quite surprised when her very well-dressed son just appeared on her front porch one day. That being said, she couldn't help but be proud of him as he looked to be in good health and had apparently made a good living for himself. Such a good living, in fact, that Titanic offered to buy his mom a house back in Manon, where he had been born, as she still had family there that could help her with his remaining siblings. That was, if she wanted to move, to which his mother responded that she had hated the farm from the moment she had set foot on it. She was then delighted to move into the two-story house her son bought for her. He even had a new electric toaster installed in the kitchen, and also made sure to, as a final surprise, hide an additional $1,000 in a sugar bowl in the kitchen, in a kind of reverse of what his father had done when he had taken her last $5 from the sugar bowl before he left. Titanic then had taken care of his mother, but still he did not return home to his wife in Pittsburgh. Instead, he now headed for St. Louis, hiring a bodyguard along the way to watch his back in return for 10% of his winnings. His target in St. Louis was one George Dalton, who ran a little gambling den in the back of a tailor shop in the rough part of town. A known associate of bootleggers and loan sharks, Dalton in particular was known to have a weakness for dice and drinking. Indeed, the more he drank, the more he played, and typically the more he played, the more money he lost, meaning he was the perfect mark for a roving gambler like Titanic. Indeed, over the span of a few weeks, the man from out of town had reportedly won some $40,000 off of Dalton. Yet when it came time to pay off his debts, Dalton started getting cagey. First, he tried offering Titanic a check, since apparently he didn't have the cash to cover his debts outright, but gamblers didn't trust checks. It was cash or nothing. Now, this was something Dalton should have known, and maybe he did, as he quickly had a proposition for Titanic. You see, he knew where the dock workers gathered to gamble after they got their paychecks. As Dalton figured it, someone like Titanic could easily go there and clear these men out. Now, this would leave Titanic with their paychecks, which he didn't want. Dalton, though, had the ability to cash the checks for Titanic, and he figured this would net them enough money that they would be square. Titanic then, as expected, cleaned out the dock workers, and subsequently handed their checks over to Dalton, who invited the traveling gambler back to his shop the following day, as by then he'd had the financial dealings all sorted out. When Titanic arrived the next day, he was surprised when he was greeted not just by Dalton and his regular flunkies, but by 3 women as well. Dalton then invited Titanic and his bodyguard to come and join the festivities. The roaming gambler then turned on the charm as he started telling jokes to entertain the ladies, while Dalton got him the money he was owed. After some time had passed, Titanic, with money in hand and his bodyguard in tow, moved to depart. It was at this moment, though, that one of Dalton's henchmen inexplicably flicked the lights outside the back door of the shop off and then quickly back on again. An incredibly suspicious and not at all sly move that both Titanic and his bodyguard took immediate notice of. That had clearly been a signal. Still, Titanic and his man pretended to not have noticed as they continued on to the door. Yet as he touched the doorknob, Titanic paused and turned back, announcing that he had one more quick story for the ladies. Even as he was launching into his tale, though, Titanic was also reaching into his pocket to take a firm hold of his .45. Then, as he reached the end of his joke and the people in the room erupted in laughter, Titanic suddenly, without warning, pushed through the door, bursting into the alley in the process. As he did, the traveling gambler quickly spotted 2 men with handkerchiefs covering their faces, who were quite taken by surprise by his sudden appearance. They were so surprised, in fact, that it took them a moment to reach for their guns. A moment too long, as by that point, Titanic already had his gun out and was shooting both men, killing them on the spot. The gambler had now killed 3 men in his short life. After giving a warning to Dalton and his men that he knew they had set him up and were lucky they didn't end up like the men in the alleyway, Titanic either insisted that the cops were called or had his men drive him out to the local police station. While the cops would question whether he had a permit for his gun or not, he did not. Ultimately, Titanic would be let go. In fact, he was even reportedly given a permit, as apparently the two men he had killed were known criminals who had been wanted for at least 5 years for crimes ranging from bank robbery to the kidnapping and murder of a baby in Pittsburgh. Titanic then departed from St. Louis a free man and $40,000 richer, $4,000 of which he handed over to his bodyguard before finally heading back to Pittsburgh to see Alice again. His time at home, though, did not spell an end even temporarily for Titanic's gambling or even the trouble that came with it. You see, following a dice game where he won a few $1,000s, Titanic looked to make a quick exit from the riverfront warehouse where the game had taken place. To that end, Alice pulled up outside driving his Packard. Now, Titanic was not trying to get away from the men whose money he had just won. Instead, he was afraid of hijackers who also knew of the games and would be looking to rob the winners. Their getaway, though, wasn't quick enough because as they were driving off, a pair of highwaymen leaped out and began shooting at the car. Titanic, who had taken the wheel, responded by pulling out his .45 and shooting back. Meanwhile, Alice too leapt into action as she grabbed the Luger her husband had stashed in the glove box and also started shooting at the highwaymen leaning out of the car to do so. As you see, Alice not only knew her guns but also knew how to shoot them, having gone hunting with her father throughout her childhood. Still, despite Alice showing that she had the ability and willingness to defend herself, Titanic would leave her behind in Pittsburgh when he next took to the road. This time, though, he would be driving a new top-of-the-line Pierce Arrow that was reportedly the same type of car that Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States himself, was said to own. Also note, during this road trip, Titanic would find himself a new game that would eventually become a new obsession. You see, the roving gambler was driving through Oklahoma in his brand new Pierce Arrow when he stopped off at a roadside lemonade stand, from where he could see a man swinging the stick-like object and hitting some little balls into a field which had a bunch of signs marking the distance. This was the first driving range Titanic had ever seen, and so when he wandered over to get a better look, he asked a man if he could hit a couple of balls. The other man kindly lent Titanic use of his club, and was subsequently impressed by how the stranger hit the ball, especially when Titanic informed him he had never so much as touched a golf club before in his life. And with that, the seeds were planted for many a future scheme. Titanic's golfing exploits, though, were still a ways off yet. In the meantime, however, the traveling gambler was headed for the city of St. Joseph. His plan here was to take part in a game of 5-card stud that was known to be held above a now-shuttered saloon, seeing as how we are now in the era of Prohibition. This room above the closed-down saloon, though, was not the safest location in the world, as it had already been robbed so many times that the host had hooked up an alarm bell to ring whenever somebody came up the back stairs. Knowing then that he would be playing in such a dangerous locale, Titanic made sure to hire a bodyguard by the name of Dick Wade to watch his back. Now, Wade apparently took his job seriously and wasn't just there for show, as when the alarm bell rang one night when Titanic was playing cards, while the others in the room took cover, Dick and Titanic flipped over the table and pulled out their guns. They were then ready to meet the men who subsequently burst through the door to the room, firing as they entered. Titanic and Dick then answered back, and soon the pair of hijackers were laying on the floor. 2 more men then were potentially dead at Titanic's hands, but again it was a case of self-defense, and so the police let him go. The life of a traveling gambler then was getting more dangerous the more successful he was, but this did not seem to dissuade Titanic in the least. If anything, having conquered the best the towns and small cities had to offer, it seemed that the man known as Titanic was ready to try his hand at the big time. It was time then to start hitting the big cities and the high rollers therein. Chicago, one of the nation's biggest cities, also at the time happened to be the home of one of its highest of high rollers, Nick the Greek Dandalos. Now, unlike Titanic, Nick came from a wealthy family that had interest in shipping tobacco and figs. With such family fortunes to lean on, Nick the Greek got his kicks gambling insane amounts of money, as he reportedly declared that, quote, "The next best thing to gambling and winning is gambling and losing." With such an attitude, Nick the Greek became a legendary figure in the world of gamblers, as he was known to make outrageous bets. partially because if he lost, all he had to do was wire his family back in Greece, and he would have another $200,000 already on its way. Now, you would think someone like Nick the Greek with the reputation he had would be a tempting target for an up-and-comer like Titanic. Yet that's not what happened. While we don't know the exact nature of their first encounter, we do know the pair decided to team up. Indeed, it would be through Nick the Greek that Titanic got access to the real high rollers, millionaire oilmen and the like who thought little of betting $50,000 a hand. Plus, when Titanic and Nick played cards, unbeknownst to the other men at the table, the two were secretly working together, using a secret set of discreet signals to let the other know what was in their hand. That way, whoever had the better hand would stay in while the other bowed out. However, before doing so, they always made sure to raise the stakes so the pot the other man would eventually win would be as large as possible. Both then were apparently more than happy to assist the other, and indeed within just a few months of being in Chicago, Titanic was said to have won more money than he had in 3 years on the road. All in all, Titanic really took a liking to Chicago, as in addition to the games with Nick the Greek, the city, thanks to the great migration of Southern African Americans moving north, had a thriving blues and jazz scene that he much appreciated. Then there were the city's country clubs that offered plenty of opportunities to play golf, a game not only popular with the normal well-heeled types, but also with a number of the city's gangsters thanks to their boss Al Capone's well-known love of the game. So after waking up around noon after a night of gambling, Titanic would often spend his afternoons at a country club, where even though he had yet to actually bother learning the intricacies of the game, he still managed to make money off of it. One of his favorite ways in doing so involved betting the wealthy golfers $1,000 that he could hit a golf ball into the watered hazard and then retrieve the exact same ball. In fact, to prove that he was good to his word and wasn't bringing back just any ball that had been hit into the hazard, Titanic would mark the ball with an X to prove he was coming back with the same one. Or, the exact same trick he had used as a teenager to win a fancy new fishing pole. Now, in those days, Capone's influence was everywhere in Chicago. It was very much his city, as he dominated the underworld, running not only the bootleggers and prostitution rackets, but he also had his fingers in the gambling rackets as well. Indeed, Capone had the power to say who did and did not get to play in the city's highest stakes games. So, while Titanic was said to have not liked the gangster all that much due to his notoriously foul mouth, he and Nick the Greek still made sure to stay on the mob boss's good side. Indeed, even though Capone himself wasn't a card player, preferring to bet on horses and baseball, he still recognized that the team of Titanic and Nick the Greek was sure to clean out the other high rollers in town, and so he wanted in. So, in exchange for setting up games for the pair with some of the richest high rollers in the region, Capone took a 25% cut of their winnings. In all, Titanic would spend a couple of years frequenting the gambling halls of Chicago and making money off the high rollers there. But by the winter of 1923 and 24, Titanic was looking to move on to greener and warmer pastures, having set his sights on California. You see, Nick the Greek had told him about a place in San Francisco called the Kingston Club, where, according to Nick, they were, quote, setting up a big game out there that's never going to end. There's going to be more money coming in there than you and I together have ever seen. Titanic then was quite excited about this prospect, so after swinging back to Pittsburgh to pay a visit to his wife, he was soon off again, this time to California. Now, the Kingston Club would be frequented by everyone from wealthy bootleggers to more legitimate types like bankers, lawyers, and politicians. It wasn't a fancy high-class place, and one that Titanic himself likely couldn't have gotten into if not for his connection with Nick the Greek. Once inside, though, he was right at home playing high-money games against the likes of city council members and the vice president of the San Francisco Guarantee Trust, people who Titanic reportedly quite enjoyed taking money from. Indeed, over the course of a few months, the traveling gambler reportedly won over $250,000, which, when adjusted for inflation, comes out to about $4.3 million in today's money. And by the end of his time there a year and a half later, Titanic had reportedly won just under $2 million in cash and a pair of cars, all from playing in the Kingston Club alone. The Kingston Club, though, wasn't Titanic's only source of fun and money-making opportunities in San Francisco, as the city's weather made it an ideal location to play golf, especially since he found that he could only take playing cards through the night for 16 hours before sleeping away most of the day, just to wake up and start all over again for so long. He needed to see the sun and get some fresh air, and golfing, as it turned out, provided him the perfect opportunity to do just that and make some money in the process. As while on some level Titanic did seem to enjoy the game, it does feel like a part of his passion came down to the same reason why he loved playing cards and throwing dice, meaning it offered him a chance to gamble and make money. You see,